Would a senior wealth manager and editor of a wealth management magazine have to say about critical thinking, decision making, and how you manage your own portfolio and how you work with someone to make sure you get the best possible outcomes? Well, we're going to find out about that this week. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. This week, we're speaking with David Kitai. He is the senior editor for the wealth division of Key Media, and Key Media are the publishers of Wealth Professional Magazine. How are you, David?
I am very well, John. How are you?
Also very, very well. I wanted to dive right in and I wanted to ask how you got started with regard to financial services media in particular, because it's an important niche.
Oh, John, you ask any journalist how they got started, it's going to be a circuitous route. I went to journalism school to write about food and wine. I was coming out of university. I lived and worked for wineries in the former Soviet Union, and I loved the stories and I loved eating, and I wanted to kind of be Anthony Bourdain. And turns out doing that really hard and very difficult and requires a lot of self-promotion and no steady paychecks. So I was a waiter for a while and, looking for more steady journalism jobs, saw Key Media come up. And this was in 2019 when I started with Key Media. Basically, they put me on the wealth publication. Now our VP of editorial, James Burton, was doing my job at WP then. He kind of took me under his wing, let me loose on the industry. And what I learned was I like telling stories. I don't necessarily need them to be about food or wine or the things I'm like deeply passionate about. Turns out financial services is full of stories and really interesting and human and deals with so many tensions and of course economics and politics and all of these kind of fascinating areas. And I've come to really love it and find, advisors are at this really interesting point where kind of the rubber hits the road between those macro forces and the very human element. And so again, it's a long way of getting to, I think, you found the people in there, or I found the people in there, and that became, my motivating force. And now I get to learn about the industry.
And I think it's great because there are a lot of people that are in finance that didn't originally set out to be in finance. They just fall into it because that's the way things go. Wondering if you could perhaps offer your thoughts on the role of media, but especially as it pertains to what it is that advisors think. How does what you write at Wealth Professional, the people at Wealth Professional write, have an impact on what advisors think? And also, how does that have an impact on the advice they give to clients across the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I think off the bat, advisors should take everything printed at Wealth Professional as gospel, the absolute truth, and they should live by it no, in no way. Media's role is a source of your daily information flow, those things that are, worth highlighting, that are worth exploring deeper, but I think is always important to remember is very much a snapshot in time, right? People talk about, the paper of record and all of that, but you go back to these papers of records, the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, whatever, and look through the past and you look at some of their reporting on stuff and you realize how wrong they turned out to be as they were reporting on major historic events and on small stories. So I think the role of media as it applies to advisors' practices and the way there is, there are many ways in which it works, but as an initial kind of conversation starter, as a thought starter, as something to provoke the next line of questioning, to provoke engagement, and also fundamentally, and this is in the roots of this industry, to kind of keep you entertained, not just as, infotainment as in just grabbing eyeballs, but to tell you an interesting story. And maybe that interesting story comes with deeper meaning. Maybe that interesting story is just about why one person took an interesting career path. And you just get to reflect on that a little bit and have a nice read.
And sometimes you just have a narrative that develops over time in terms of the way people are watching industries play out or circumstances, macro indicators play out. And then that's when the facts become stories because, let's see if we can put this into a framework that makes sense. So I wanted to ask you, that I write a lot about optimism and optimism bias. And here we are in the middle of Q4 of 2025. From your perspective, you speak with a lot of advisors, but you also sometimes speak with their clients as you do stories. Would you say that there's a normal amount or an excessive amount or an even less than normal amount of optimism in the marketplace in Q4 of 2025? And I want to see if you can distinguish between the optimism or not of the advisors that you speak with and the optimism or not of the clients that they give advice to.
Yeah, that's again a fascinating question. I think that the way I've typified the mood, and in talking with advisors and talking with a few of their clients, I do tend to speak mostly to people in the industry, and then a lot of people on the sort of the investment fund management side, portfolio management, economists, all of that is there's this weird cognitive dissonance that is out there at the moment, which is the market, all the signals on the market. If you just look at the market in isolation, right now we're talking in autumn of 2025. It is fantastic, right? Everything is telling you, great, go for it. S&P's at new highs. TSX is double digits and outperforming the S&P this year. There's all of these signals that say fabulous. And yet, and I think this is the role of inflation, social media, so many things, everybody feels like shit, John. Everybody feels terrible all the time. Like there's this weird dichotomy. And it's, I was talking with someone else. If you were to say to someone that gold would be $4,000 an ounce, and the president of the United States would be sending the National Guard into Los Angeles, and there would be, major war in Europe, they would assume that the equity market exploded, that there's nothing. And yet somehow markets have ground their way up to new heights. So I guess the optimism that's out there is tempered by this like deep existential dread, but the deep existential dread is tempered by the kind of bullish optimism and the money people are making on speculative things like crypto. So it's maybe not the most immediate answer to your question, but it's puzzling me, I'll say.
Okay, so here's what I'm trying to get at is to the extent that there is this dichotomy, this optimism married with existential dread, to what extent are advisors transferring that dichotomy to their clients when they give advice? What's your perception in terms of the extent to which a retail investor understands this dichotomy?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it's a question that I often ask advisors of, okay, you're feeling good about this sector, or you're feeling good about this one aspect of the market, or you're feeling good about the market overall. How are you reckoning with your clients' fears and your clients' maybe relationship with media or social media that inform some of those fears? And I think advisors are, again, they're sort of where the rubber hits the road here. They are working hard to temper, but they're working hard to temper pessimism, I would say. That's generally the tone I hear is it's not tempering pessimism with optimism either. It's not saying go all in, this is exciting. And it's not dismissing pessimism. It's not dismissing the existential fear that we talk about. But it's also saying if you only listen to the existential fear, you would have missed out on whatever's going on here.
Okay, well that's actually a good way of putting it, because as I say, I believe in realism. And it's ironic because I think I'm trying to ask the optimists to temper their optimism. And what I'm hearing is that there are a lot of other people that are taking the other side of the same coin, saying temper your doom and gloom as well, because the truth is frequently in the middle. And the fact of the matter is no one knows. So we have to take a measured approach as we proceed.
Absolutely.
What about social media? We talk about bubbles, and I don't want to talk about asset bubbles. I want to talk about people being in their own little bubble where they only consume certain bits of information as compared to, say, legacy media. What would you say is the impact of social media on the way people are thinking about investing and making wealth decisions in general?
Absolutely fascinating subject. And it's one I've studied through journalism school and through my work as a journalist. But I think we know that social media creates these conversation bubbles where we talk about us and we talk about them, and them becomes a different idea from who these other people are. That's at this point kind of a banal observation to make. The other point that I would make, and as you contrast it with legacy media, there's a really interesting moment in history that happened sort of in the 2010s where the great model of legacy media was not just that they owned the content production, they owned the means of its distribution, right? Mm-hmm. The paper route, functionally. When we shift, and even, initial online channels, first news websites, people would just go to cbc.com or whatever. Now people get their news almost always filtered through a social media channel. It is on LinkedIn, it is on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and that's where you're getting the link to the news. So that has become, and there have been deals, the New York Times signed a deal with then Facebook, now Meta, that basically handed over that means of distribution. Engaging only with legacy media doesn't prevent you from falling into a social media bubble, because inherently an algorithm-driven social media feed is going to be feeding you those pieces produced by legacy media. Is it better than reading Breitbart? Sure, but it's not necessarily completely exempt from that same kind of bubble think. And I will say media organizations have also responded to that new ecosystem by being probably less, no media is objective, but striving less for objectivity and striving more towards what actually drives clicks, which is op-eds, which are not journalism, and pieces that maybe are a little less interrogating of their own biases. Again, I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but there's that dynamic in there.
All right. So here's the thing. So what you're saying is that there are things in legacy media that find their way onto X and onto LinkedIn and whatever, just as easily as there are things from influencers who have no credentials or anything necessarily. So I guess what that then leads me to is the role of decision hygiene. What role do advisors have in helping their clients filter what they read so that they can be more discerning about what is and is not in fact accurate?
How do we train critical media literacy, John? That is the myth of Sisyphus. Like, we're pushing that boulder up a hill, man. It is so hard to do. And it is so hard to, in a world where those platforms flatten these different outlets and make the finfluencer look like the New York Times because you're getting it from the same place, it is very, very hard to do. The one thing that advisors have, and it is an silver bullet is maybe an overstatement, is the power of the trusted relationship, right? That is, I think, in a world where people are so isolated and so glued to what feeds and scrolls and whatever is feeding them, the human touch and the human check. And it doesn't need to be an aggressive check. It doesn't need to be a judgmental or a condemnatory check, but sort of just trying to prompt a little bit of a re-examination by asking a probing question. That can go so far into highlighting where some of these areas can actually be dangerous. The trick is doing that in a way that makes people not feel defensive. That's very hard to do.
All right, so this is gonna be a little bit edgy, but since you work mostly with financial advisors, I'm gonna ask you the same sort of question with regard to advisors. What do you think advisors are doing a good job of checking their biases and their decision hygiene in terms of the information they consume and how critical they are of whatever is coming from?
Advisors, I will say the one thing I have learned in the years I've been interviewing advisors for, no advisor is the same. So there will be a wide variety of approaches that come. However, I think there is a degree to which the professional practice does involve that degree of self-checking and that degree of checking on media and other pieces like that. Where I've seen this, and I know this because I just sort of have some of my advisor colleagues or sources and stuff on social media. The thing about social media is I can see what everybody else is commenting on LinkedIn because the algorithm's going to show it to me. And I can see where in people's politics and in people's sort of, and in some of their views about wider decisions that do affect the industry, there is suddenly a lot more bias that comes through and a lot more willingness to maybe troll or bait or parrot talking points that aren't necessarily rooted in objective fact. And that's, I think, and I'm not there for the client conversations. I've never observed any of my sources talking with their clients, so I can't know for certain the degree to which they're checking themselves in those settings. But I think there is, a degree of that social media hygiene it's something we all have to practice. It's not, and I'm not saying this with judgment. Again, it's so easy to fall into that. But I think it's only human to acknowledge that we all suffer from this.
That's a very fair answer, because I think it's very difficult. And I felt a bit sheepish even asking, because I didn't want to set you up for a question that couldn't be answered, but I was curious about your thinking. So I asked it anyway.
No, I appreciate it.
Wealth Professional has now started doing something that they didn't used to do, and that is they just this year started doing their top 40 under 40. And they just very recently released a list of the top 40 people that, in their estimation, are having a positive impact on the wealth management industry. And I went through it, and I know a number of the people that are on the list, and I find that gratifying, including Jessica Smith of Design Securities. I'm happy to say
Mm-hmm.
it's a shout out to Jessica. That's here's an industry leader who's a vice president at Design, and that's great. What is your impression of these people in terms of what it means for the future of the wealth management space? There are a lot of people that the industry tends to move as a glob, the way the most common denominator works. But ultimately, if you think about change being led, and it's led by the thought leaders that are going to be the people who will be the decision makers of the future, where do you think, having gone through the exercise of atomizing the top 40, where do you think the industry is going, and what would you say are the touchstones of what we should be expecting going forward?
Yeah, I love that you highlighted the top 40 because it's a great list and there are some great people on it. And I will say, for all the ways we rag on this industry as being too old and too white and too male, when I talk to young advisors, I am constantly impressed and amazed. There is so much care, so much wisdom, so much thought that's being put into this. And so I think with them in mind, I think actually the industry is going in a very good direction. I think that direction is it's in some ways also incentivized by the shift towards higher net worth clients and a bit more of that kind of, more bespoke practice. But I think this industry is getting very personalized and very high touch and very service oriented and very much about, I hate the word because it's used all the time, but holistic client service, right? It's the direction of the industry, and the people who are sort of the foot soldiers of that direction of travel are really oriented towards caring about and serving their clients, not extracting from them, not selling them mutual funds the way it used to be. That's what gives me kind of a lot of hope. And I think the direction of travel is actually, yeah, there are maybe flaws with this. We can talk about the mass market, but I think the clients who they will be serving will be served by people who want to understand their whole lives. And that's a great thing.
And then these advisors that are helping, again, holistically, we'll use the word maybe a little bit too much. Can you give me any examples of what they're doing to actually direct people toward better outcomes, so that maybe things that we either didn't do or didn't do very well 10 or 20 years ago that are now being done differently and better as a direct result of this more high touch type experience?
I think, without wanting to comment on investment decisions, because you'll get very different investment philosophies from different advisors, they're all upskilling. And that's the big thing I would say. They are training themselves more on whether that's how to manage alternatives or how to manage estate plans, how to work with tax planning, just getting their CFPs in addition to their CFAs. They are really working at that continuing education. And again, it's turning into, like medicine, you are practicing financial advice. And that seems to be the ethos that's driving a lot of this.
Okay, so then from there, let's talk about the way the general public might misunderstand what it is that a good advisor might do. What would you say are the 1, 2, maybe even 3 primary misunderstandings that the public has about what it is that a person giving them advice does and how they do it?
One, I think that the ongoing misconception is actually around incentives. And I think, again, it's a legacy of the old commission-based fee distribution, or not fee distribution models. And again, we can talk about the inherent conflicts of interest, and there are still flaws in the industry as it exists today. But I think a lot of the general public believe that advisors are working for their advisory firm and not for them. And I think that is still, again, there are different firms with different models, and this is an incredibly widely varied industry. But I do think there is still that misconception that all advisors have the firm's interest in mind before the client's. And that is certainly not the case. The other piece, I think, is actually that financial advisors can do more. I talked about upskilling, but the idea is that, I'm going to a financial advisor. They can also, write my will and, file my taxes and all that other kind of stuff. Whereas, again, there is quite a limited scope in this, even for those people who are more holistic and all of that. And I think some of that is a marketing problem. The industry has run the holistic stuff too far in the marketing, and now there's the perception that they can actually deliver it. And there are certain areas where an advisor simply can't.
Yeah, and I think a good holistic advisor might be a bit of a traffic cop. Like I have a spouse who is a family lawyer. If someone needs a will, I'm not going to do it, but I can say you could talk to someone like her. There are lots of I work with a tax professional to file my own taxes. I know a lot about tax, but I don't want to be the person who files my own. Here, I'll introduce you to someone who is a specialist on the tax side if you want that. I can help you with broad, large-scale strategic decision-making in terms of, minimizing taxes here and there. But in terms of the nitty-gritty, that's the sort of thing where most financial advisors will be strong generalists who are purposeful traffic cops who will know where the Peter principle, they know what they know, and they also are keenly aware of what they don't know, and they don't want to venture beyond their own capacity, right? They don't want to overstate what they can do, even though there's a tendency to make it sound like, come to me and I can solve all your problems.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a fascinating, and again, the idea of being, that hub and spoke model, or the sort of triage, or as you say, traffic cop. I love mixing metaphors because I'm a writer, and I'm actually a pretty bad writer. So, no, that's what I would really, I think that's the advisors who seem to be managing this expectation successfully are the ones doing exactly what you've said.
So let's wrap this up. I always like to, my last question is always the same. The podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. If it was up to you, David, what advice would you give to the listeners that would help them make better wealth decisions?
Oh, John, that's first of all, you've managed to get a journalist to talk and not to answer and not ask questions. So you're already getting me out of my comfort zone. Now I'm having to give advice. I genuinely, working with an advisor in some capacity really does help. And it helps not just with the, obviously investment returns are one thing, and that's something that's actually relatively easy to replicate these days. But the discipline, the touchstones, the sort of the unity of purpose that goes into building wealth as, an ordinary middle income individual or family in Canada today, there are so many draws and so many ways in which your own kind of lizard brain can skew your thinking and make you make a different decision. Finding someone who can be that human source of trust and discipline and just a reminder of what you're working towards is incredibly valuable. I found that in my relationship with my own advisor to be very valuable. And I found that as something that, it is the unspoken value, but it is really the value that can come when you work with an advisor.
Excellent. That's a really nice way to end. I want to thank you for your time today, David. It was a real pleasure. All the best.
John, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thanks for giving me a platform. This is a rare treat.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.